I so much appreciate the studied and thoughtful words of my colleague from Virginia, and I appreciate his leadership on the War Powers Resolution that we will be voting on, as he put it, within the next 48 hours. My question is the United States still a republic? Do we still have a Constitution that means anything? That Constitution assigns taxation authority to Congress. But this body sat idle while President Trump stole the taxation authority through his tariffs for a year. No other president even considered the possibility of stealing the power of taxation. They always came, including for tariffs, they always came to Congress because that's what the Constitution says. The responsibility is here. The power of the purse is assigned to Congress in the Constitution. That is the defining difference between an authoritarian strongman government and a democratic republic. It is the representatives of every corner of the land coming together and designing the programs and deciding how much those programs should be funded. And then it's the responsibility of the president to carry out those programs. But this president decided not to. He canceled program after program that was authorized and funded by Congress, by law, with the words, "I'm canceling this program because it doesn't align with the priorities of this administration." Under our Constitution, the president doesn't get to do that. But this body sat idle, allowing the president to steal the power of the purse, and yet we took an oath to the Constitution and did nothing to defend it when the president violated it. And now the power of war. The Constitution assigns that power directly to Congress. Madison noted the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. The Constitution has accordingly, with studied care, vested the question in the legislature. And yet, President Trump just launched a war. He didn't call it a strike or a limited strike. He launched a war. He called it a war. It is a war. It was a surprise attack. I was thinking about how we felt when Japan launched a surprise attack on Hawaii. Now we've done that to Iran. Consider that parallel. And we did it while we were in the middle of negotiations. We did it while we were saying the negotiations are going very well. And yet we launched a surprise, devastating attack that the president says he will pursue for week after week until the job is done. But what is the job? There was no imminent threat to the United States of America. Now, on the way walking over here from my office, a reporter said, Marco Rubio has clarified there was an imminent threat, and that the imminent threat was that Israel was going to strike Iran, and Iran would retaliate against bases in the region, so we had to go to war. Are we now such an enfeebled nation that Israel decides when we go to war? And we couldn't just say to Netanyahu, hell no, you're not going to strike Iran? Are we like on the leash? We are the puppy dog on the leash held by Bibi Netanyahu? Is that what has become of the great United States of America? And yet, if the information I was told on the way here, that the argument now is the imminent threat that we had to respond to was that Netanyahu was going to strike Iran, and thus the risk of retaliation, and thus we needed to strike Iran first. Well, what about the option of telling Bibi, hell no, you're not going to do that? We're in the middle of negotiations that are going quite well to end the threat that Iran poses in developing nuclear weapons. And by the way, they aren't developing nuclear weapons. And by the way, we had a diplomatic path that was pretty phenomenal. You know, shouldn't it always be diplomacy before war? And we had diplomacy, setting out an agreement in which Iran dismantled its plutonium reactor and filled it with concrete, in which they exported all of their more highly enriched uranium outside of Iran. An agreement in which so much was removed and so many inspectors were present to make sure that there was no nuclear weapon program. But who tore up that treaty? The same man who just launched a war in violation of the Constitution of the United States. You know, when Madison spoke and said the executive is the branch of power most interested in war, he prefaced it by saying the Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrate, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war. What was he talking about? He's talking about the fact that a head of state may want to write their name in history by conquering land. A head of state may want to write their name in history by eliminating some foreign leader they don't like. And that so often those justifications are not in the interest of the country as a whole. And therefore, there has to be a debate of the representatives of the country as a whole as to whether to engage in such a war. That was the wisdom. With studied care, the founders invested in this chamber. I powerfully disagreed with President George W. Bush's war on Iraq. It was justified by an argument that there were weapons of mass destruction. And the inspectors in Iraq said, we will go anywhere and look at anything that you, the United States, think that there is a depot of weapons of mass destruction. And the Bush administration said, well, you're not looking in the right places. And the inspectors said, we'll go anywhere you want. And the United States said, they're sneaking them out the back gate when you come in the front gate. And the inspectors said, we will cover the back gate. It seemed like the argument was terribly flimsy, and yet possibly true. But at least George W. Bush came to Congress in the preceding year, in 2002, and said, I want an authorization for the use of military force because I'm concerned about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And there was a significant debate here. And eventually, it passed in October of 2002. And that debate carried the Senate to a favorable outcome of creating an AUMF by a 77 to 23 vote. I do not think Congress reached the right decision on that day, but at least, as the founders intended, it was debated here in this chamber. So that one person who might want to write his name in history by conquering some other foreign leaders, changing the dynamic in the world, conquering new lands, at least such an authoritarian leader must have their ambitions tempered by this chamber. But there was no tempering here. There has been no debate on an authorization for the use of military force, as there should have been, and as the President should have requested. And I hope, had we had such a debate, we would have come to a better, wiser conclusion than our predecessors did back in 2002. This is an extraordinarily dangerous moment for America because we have a president who has repeatedly shredded the Constitution. He shredded it on taxation powers allocated to Congress by the Constitution. He shredded it by canceling the power of the purse assigned programs that are developed by the Congress under the power of the purse and ending them without authorization. And now he's shredded it by going to war in Iran without an authorization for the use of military force. So we will use the one tool we have, the War Powers Resolution, to say, Mr. President, hell no. And we should say hell no at a minimum to say, Mr. President, if you want that power, come and put before us a proposal for the authorization for military force so that it will be properly debated in advance. Presidents squander the blood of our children and the wealth of our nation should never, ever be allowed to do so without the studied consent of Congress to address an extraordinarily dangerous situation. Think about how many people died in Afghanistan and Iraq. Think about the 8,000 who died. How about the 50,000 who were so seriously injured? How about the $8 trillion? Blood and purse. We must vote for the War Powers Resolution to say, hell no, Mr. President, end this war. Thank you.